But maybe instead of approaching the Bible and saying, well, we've got what we know in Earth history, so let's just change some details in the Bible to make it fit Earth history. Let's flip that on its head. What if we say, well, the Bible is truth. Let's go back and look at Earth history again and maybe realize, maybe we've messed up some things there. Maybe we need to tweak some things right there and make it fit with what we see revealed to us by God himself. I am wanting to talk to you today about thinking biblically about Earth history. So I'm a paleontologist, and that means I get to play around with rocks and fossils and those kinds of things. And you get to go to a place like the Grand Canyon. It's a beautiful place. People love to go here. Tons and tons of people coming every year. And we can see God's glory on display everywhere we look, right? But we also, when we read the displays and we go into the visitor center and those kinds of things, we see that there are these statements about millions of years in evolution. And these kinds of things can sometimes be problematic for Christians as they're interacting with them. What do I do with this? I mean, I want to go and enjoy the Grand Canyon. I want to see the rocks and fossils. I want to go to a museum or watch a documentary. But what do I do with these things that seem to disagree with the Bible? Because if you look at a kind of what mainstream science says about Earth history, they state it with great certainty. In the same way you talk about gravity or you talk about cell theory or muscle theory, they'll say things like, oh, the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. As you can see on that geologic timescale there, that you have your first animals showing, or first living things showing up at about 4 billion years. You have your first animals at around 530 million years, your first dinosaurs at 230 million years, and your first humans at 300,000 years. That's a lot of time. And not only that, the appearance of different creatures in the rock record is thought by most scientists to be because of evolution, right? That you have this tree of life, this universal common descent from single-celled organisms all the way up to trees and mushrooms and people. So we hear these things and we think, well, what do we do with them as Christians? Because if we read the Bible, we get this idea that really the creation can't be that long ago. I mean, if you actually sit there and add up the genealogies, you end up with just a few thousand years of time. And this was done by Archbishop James Ussher in the 1600s, and he got a very precise date, like 4004 BC on October the 22nd, which is a little silly to be that precise. There's no way you could get it that close. But the point is, yeah, it's nowhere near the 4.6 billion years of Earth history, even near the 300,000 years that humans are supposed to have existed. Not only that, but the Bible clearly presents the idea that different creatures were specially created over a period of a week, not over incredibly long periods of time, and not coming from a single ancestor, but being specially created different creatures. Now, this has puzzled people as they've started to investigate geology and paleontology back in the 1800s, as they started to recognize that it looked like a lot of time was involved. So they're finding these unusual fossils down below where we typically find archaeological remains. And so as they were trying to work through it, many of them being Christians, they were trying to sort through, well, how do we reconcile these things? And one of the really popular ideas, especially back in the 1800s, was what we call Old Earth. And the idea with this is that they would accept that God created different kinds of creatures. There's no evolution, at least not universal common descent involved, but the earth is very ancient. And so how do you reconcile this with the text of Scripture? Well, one of the popular ways is what we call the gap theory. And the idea of the gap theory was that between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, there was this long, indefinite period of time, right? So Genesis 1:1, God created the heavens and the earth. And then 1:2, it talks about the earth being formless and void. And so they said, well, in between that is when all the geologic record and the fossils and dinosaurs and all that stuff happened. Well, the problem with this idea, textually, is that the Hebrew text does not allow for a gap. You talk to any modern Hebrew scholar, they're going to tell you, no, there's no gap in the text at all. It flows right in there. So another popular idea was the day-age theory. And this is the idea that the different days during the creation week are actually in really, really long periods of time. Okay, so the idea being that, like, instead of there being just one day, 24 hours, it might be, hundreds of thousands or millions of years. Now, once again, the text does not allow for this. And actually, it's going to create some problems even with the science we'll see in a minute, because the way that an old Earth creationist thinks about the fossil record is what we call progressive creation. Progressive creation is the idea that God made a bunch of creatures and then they died. And he made a bunch of creatures and then they died. And he made a bunch of creatures and they died, and just stacking up the layers like that. Now, if you're going to have this perspective, whether it's day age or gap theory, you have some interesting problems with not specifically the words in the text, but the meaning of the text, the overall narrative, what's going on there. For instance, the Bible states that plants were made on day 3, but the sun wasn't made until day 4. But anyone who's working on, anything related to geology or paleontology would say, well, the sun has to be here before plants evolved, right? The sun's got to be here at least when the Earth was formed 4.6 billion years ago, maybe before. Plants are only showing up, around 400 million years ago, 300 million years ago, between there. So these are completely different narratives, right? So just adding time to the days or adding time between the days doesn't actually give you any way to reconcile those two things. Not only that, but some people have taken the approach of having old Earth and the evolution. They've just said, let's take in the whole narrative from conventional science, and let's just run with that. And so they would have God creating the first organisms, and then they would evolve over time. Either he just let it happen, or he superintended it, maybe even stepped in occasionally to help things out. And then eventually, when human beings evolved, Homo sapiens, God placed a soul in them, or his image on them, and they became true humans. Now, the really big idea you run into with this, besides things we've already talked about, is how it deals with humanity and with death. Because the Bible presents it that humans were created without death, but then when Adam and Eve sinned, death came into the world as a result of sin. But if you're going to accept theistic evolution or even old Earth creation, you have to have death and suffering there long before humans show up. In fact, they're just a normal part of the nature. So how do we think through this as Christians? What do we do with Earth history? Do we just throw out the whole thing and say, well, it's unknowable? I meet some Christians who just say, well, maybe everything is, maybe it's not real and we don't need to worry about it. I meet other Christians who just back away and they say, I don't want anything to do with that. But the Bible and its worldview are all-encompassing. It touches on every area of life. And certainly if it didn't, what would be the point in believing it, right? God is the God of all things. And so we too can approach Earth history. But maybe instead of approaching the Bible and saying, well, we've got what we know in Earth history, so let's just change some details in the Bible to make it fit Earth history. Let's flip that on its head. What if we say, well, the Bible is truth. Let's go back and look at Earth history again and maybe realize, maybe we've messed up some things there. Maybe we need to tweak some things right there and make it fit with what we see revealed to us by God himself. So that's what we're going to be doing in this lecture series. We're going to be looking at what does the Bible present for Earth history, and then how do we think through it and make sense of what we see in nature as it relates to the Bible. And what's really cool is that the opening chapters of Genesis, really chapters 1 through 11, provide for us a really nice framework to think about Earth history in the past. And there's kind of 4 big events that you notice there. We can use these as like mileposts or signs going along the way. And the first one we see, our first event, is the creation itself, right? The creation week. And you can see that I've got there a table showing the different days of creation and what happens on each day. We'll spend more time on this in a later lecture. But a couple of things I want you to notice right now. Number 1, humans, land animals, and birds in Genesis 1:30 are described as eating plants alone. It's not talked about eating meat. And that makes sense because we don't think there's any death or suffering before Adam and Eve sin. Second thing I want you to notice about Genesis 1 is that the very last verse says that God called it very good. When he was done creating these 6 days of creation, he said, it's very good. And that makes sense. Once again, if there's not suffering and death yet, sin is not entered into the picture, it is very good. And that is distinct from our world today. It still shows the glory of God, but we now have a creation that is marked by struggle and suffering and death. Our second event that we want to look at is the fall and the curse. These two things are related. The fall is when humans rebel against God. We read about this in Genesis chapter 3. And when they do that, sin comes in and death comes in for their descendants as well. And this is what it says in Romans 5:12, right? Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world and death through sin, so death spread to all men because all sinned. But not only were humans affected, but the whole of the creation. In fact, you can read it in Genesis 3 and then later Romans 8 that all of creation is put under a curse. Paul says in Romans 8 that the creation has been subjected to futility, not willingly, but by him who subjected it in hope that it'll be set free. It's in bondage right now. It's not what it could be because it's marked by this struggle and suffering. And one of the things talked about in Genesis 3 as it relates to kind of the curse is that it says that the ground would produce thorns and thistles for Adam. Right there you can see a picture of a fossil of the plant Saudonia that has thorns on it. This plant is supposedly over 300 million years old. So once again, we have this little bit of a conundrum here. Well, if that plant is actually as old as people tell us it is, then how do we make sense of the fact that we don't find human fossils until 300,000 years ago? And that's where we need to come at it once again saying, okay, let's start with the text and then rethink what we actually see in nature and figure out, are we understanding these things correctly or not? Our third event is the flood. The flood is described in Genesis as a global catastrophe. And it killed all humans and creatures with the breath of life in their nostrils outside the ark. It was completely global in its scope, killing everything. And it's actually a year-long event, actually over a year. You might think it was just 40 days and 40 nights. And, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, it says straight. But if you read the text, you can see that there's more and more time afterwards. It talks about other time markers after that event. So it was a really big, catastrophic event that would completely reshape the earth. And so if we're going to think about Earth history, yeah, a global flood is going to leave some kind of record in the rocks. Our fourth event is the Tower of Babel. And the Tower of Babel is where people, instead of spreading all over the earth, came together and built a tower to reach up to heaven. They were in rebellion against God. And God forced them to stop building the tower by confusing their languages. And at that point, they started spreading all over the earth. And so this is an important marker, of course, for humans, but also for nature. Because after the flood, but before the Tower of Babel, animals are spreading all over the earth, plants are spreading all over the earth, but people are not. But after the Tower of Babel, people are spreading, and so they would start interacting with nature all around the world and leaving a record. And so we should be able to find that in the rocks. As a result, we can lay out here a biblical timeline based on the things we've talked about. We have a creation, a fall, the flood, the Tower of Babel. And I've put up here Christ's birth as well, just to kind of give us a reference frame there. We're talking about deep history, even before the nation of Israel. Now, those things we get directly from the text, but we can start inferring about kind of the different periods of time, or we could call them worlds, in between these events, because they would be very different. For instance, there would be a pre-fall world between the creation and the fall. This world would not be marked by suffering and death. It'd be very unique compared to what we know today. And after the fall, but before the flood, we could have what we call a pre-flood world. And this world would also be very different. It hadn't been marked yet by this global catastrophe. We live in a post-catastrophe world, what we call a post-flood world. And here I've even split it up more by having a post-Babel world, which would be one where humans are interacting more and more with nature. So join me as we consider these things in greater detail: the creation, the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel, and how we can understand Earth history by looking at it from this particular perspective.